In this video, I'm going to talk about who I think is every NHL team's best prospect. So if that sounds good to you guys, be sure to stick around till the end of the video to see who your team's best prospect is. Unless you're a Ducks fan, because I'm going to be talking about them right away. So, for the Anaheim Ducks, I believe their best prospect is Mason McTavish. The Ducks have one of the better prospect pools in the league, so there are some options here. I chose McTavish as I feel he is the most NHL ready and plays a style of game that I think translates well to the NHL. He could be a legit Calder contender next season. Next, for the Calgary Flames, I have Matthew Coronato. I get the impression that Coronato is a pretty underrated prospect. For a guy who can score as much as he doesn't seem to get talked about that much in prospect nerd circles. I really like him. His hands are silky, and he's got an above average shot, which he uses all the time, making him a volume goal scorer, which is the kind of player I like a lot. Next, for the Edmonton Oilers, I have Stuart Skinner. Now, Edmonton's prospect pool is pretty thin, and picking Reed Schaefer 32nd overall didn't help when guys like Jagger Firkus were available in the 2022 draft. Skinner is perhaps one of the more valuable prospects in the league as he is a goalie on a team that needs help in goal. From what we've seen of him so far, it looks like he could be a pretty decent goalie in the NHL, but you really never know with goalies until they're established. Next, for the Los Angeles Kings, I have Brandt Clarke. Like the Ducks, the Kings have a pretty solid prospect pool. There are some options when it comes to who their best prospect is, but I went with Brandt Clarke. With guys like Sean Durzi and Jordan Spence already playing with the big club, LA's defense potentially looks to rival that of Colorado's in a couple of years. And as a Sharks fan, that is an absolutely terrifying statement. For my favorite team, the San Jose Sharks, I have William Eklund. This choice was pretty obvious to me. The Sharks have a decent prospect pool in total, but they don't really have any legitimate high-end talent. The closest they get to that is Eklund. Perhaps if he develops well, he could still reach that ceiling as like a top line winger, but his last season of development, quite honestly, was not very encouraging. For the Seattle Kraken, I have, of course, Shane Wright. Now, I think the Kraken have actually drafted pretty well, pretty smart in general, but Wright was an obvious choice to me. There is an argument here for Matty Beniers, and in the end, the two will likely be pretty close to each other in terms of how impactful they are in the NHL, but for now, I give the edge to Wright. For the Vancouver Canucks, I have Jonathan Lekkerimaki. The Canucks have some guys that I like, such as Jet Wu, but overall their prospect pool is kind of underwhelming. Lekkerimaki is probably the highest impact guy they have right now, as I see him as a potential 30 goal scorer. For the Vegas Golden Knights, I have Brendan Brisson. Vegas's prospect pool is effectively Brisson and some guys. I do like Brisson, so as a team's best prospect, I don't think he's actually that bad, but there's basically no prospects that are really that noteworthy behind him in that system, so Vegas could really use a few extra draft picks, but as a contending team, I don't think they're going to be accumulating many draft picks in the coming seasons. Before I get into the Central Division teams, I would like to ask if you are enjoying this video, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. This video took a lot of time for me to make, and it would really help me out. Thanks. Now, in the Central Division, starting off with the Arizona Coyotes, I have Logan Cooley. Cooley is one of the more dynamic and creative NHL-affiliated prospects right now. While I do like Shane Wright more, I think Cooley potentially has a slightly higher ceiling, so either prospect would have been fine to build around if you're the Coyotes, and regardless, either of them would have been the Coyotes' best prospect. For the Chicago Blackhawks, I have Frank Nazar. Chicago's prospect pool stands to get a lot better in the next couple of years, but they've already improved it quite a bit with their aggressive 2022 draft. Nazar in particular, I think, was a great pick. He's fast, has great hands, a good shot, and he can score. He plays a very modern version of the game that I think will translate to the NHL seamlessly once he makes that jump. For the Colorado Avalanche, I have Ben Myers. The Avalanche's prospect pool is understandably thin, leaving Ben Myers as their last real decent prospect, unless you consider Byram to still be a prospect. Now, Myers certainly isn't the sexiest of prospects, and admittedly, he probably is one of the weaker top prospects in the league, but he should still be an effective hockey player for the Avs later down the road. For the Dallas Stars, I have one of my favorite prospects in the league right now, and that is Logan Stankovin. In fact, I would probably say that Stankovin is my favorite NHL affiliated prospect at the moment, and that's not just because I am a Stars fan. Yes, I am a fan of two teams. For me, he was easily the most fun player to watch in the WHL last season, aside from Connor Bedard. His development really took off this season, and he should be challenging for a roster spot on the Stars out of training camp. For the Minnesota Wild, I have Marco Rossi. Rossi would probably be playing in the NHL already if it wasn't for his bad bout of COVID. This past season, he put up 53 points in 63 AHL games with the Iowa Wild, a pretty good indication that he's ready for the jump to the pro game. Minnesota could really use another ELC on the books right now as well, so the timing is great for the team. For the Nashville Predators, I have Yaroslav Askarov. Nashville doesn't have a ton of high-end prospects to choose from, but I think most would say Askarov is the best of the bunch. As a goalie, it's always a bit of a longer road to the NHL, and development can be a bit inconsistent even after making the show, so we will have to see just how good Askarov can really be. He was one of the most highly touted goalie prospects in the last decade, so hopefully he can live up to the hype, at least in part, but with Saros as the clear starter, it's unclear what kind of role he'll play in the NHL, at least for a while. For St. Louis, I have Jake Neighbors. Neighbors is another guy that I think is a little bit underrated. His playmaking ability is of a pretty high level, and he has the physicality to play a Blues-style game already. He probably could have played all of last season with the Blues, but they decided to give him another year in juniors. He's a guy I'm pretty excited to watch for next season. Finally, rounding out our Central Division teams, we have the Winnipeg Jets, and to me, their best prospect is Brad Lambert. Lambert was one of my favorite players to watch in the 2022 draft class. I was not surprised when he fell to Winnipeg at 30, but I was a bit disappointed. This is a player that I think easily had top 10 skill in the draft class. If Winnipeg can work with him and he can get his development back on the right track, he could be one of the best deals of the draft. That being said, there is a good amount of risk here, but overall, I do still think he's their best prospect. Now moving on to the Metro Division, and with the Carolina Hurricanes, I have another 2022 draft pick in Gleb Tariqazov. Carolina is one of the best teams in the NHL at drafting right now. That, I think, is pretty undeniable. Getting Tariqazov at 60th overall was unreal value. He has a lot of work to do with rounding out his game, especially on defense, but Gleb has top 6, if not top line scoring winger written all over him. It's not often you get your best prospect or a prospect like that in general in the second round, but I think that is exactly what Carolina did with Tariqazov. Next, for the Columbus Blue Jackets, I have Kent Johnson. Johnson is really just an overall excellent prospect. Nothing in his game stands out as a major weakness to me. He reads plays really well and has the speed and skill to take advantage of mistakes, as well as create scoring chances, both on the rush and in the cycle consistently. He should be one of the favorites for the Calder next season, especially if he gets a shot at playing with Gaudreau and or Laine. Moving on to the New Jersey Devils, I believe that their best prospect right now is Alexander Holtz. Holtz is part of a very promising young forward core in New Jersey. His shot is absolutely elite, to the point where I would not be surprised if he ended up on the Devils' top line with Jack Hughes, putting up 30 goal seasons with regularity in the coming years. Next, with the New York Islanders, I have Aatu Räty. Räty is part of the reason I have so much confidence in Brad Lambert. In his draft season, Räty put up a mere 6 goals and 7 assists for 13 points in the Liga, not dissimilar to what Lambert's production was like this season. Eventually, Räty fell to the Islanders with the 52nd pick when he was initially thought of as a top 5 guy going into his draft year. This season, he had 40 points in 41 games. I think he's going to be just fine. Next, with the New York Rangers, I have Brennan Othmann. Now, Othmann is arguably the most overrated prospect in this video, but I don't know who else from the Rangers I could have here. Perhaps Niels Lundqvist, but I think Othmann will be a bit more impactful in the NHL. That being said, I don't see him as some elite top 6 guy a lot of Rangers fans seem to see in him. I think he'll more likely be a useful third liner, maybe middle 6 guy that can fill in the top 6 on occasion, but don't expect to be super blown away by him. For the Philadelphia Flyers, I have Ivan Fedotov. Fedotov is a perfect example of why you should draft a goalie late in the draft every year. You never know when a goalie might pop off. Fedotov certainly has done that, putting up a .919 and 22 regular season KHL games last year, and an even more impressive .937 save percentage and .185 goals against average in 22 playoff games, going 16-6. The only thing that remains in question is whether or not he'll actually be able to come to North America, but that's a topic for an entirely different video. Next, for the Pittsburgh Penguins, I have Pierre-Olivier Joseph. The Penguins aren't exactly burdened with choice when it comes to their prospect pool. Pierre-Olivier Joseph is pretty obviously their best prospect to me. I see him as a guy who can run a power play in the NHL, perhaps not a top unit, but maybe a bottom pair guy that runs their second power play and puts up 30 to 40 points a season. For the Washington Capitals, I have another 2022 draft pick in Ivan Miroshnichenko. There's an argument for Hendrix Lapierre here, but I think Miroshnichenko has far higher upside. He's obviously a bit further away, as Lapierre will likely play a significant number of NHL games this season, but to me, that kind of solidifies Miroshnichenko's status as the Caps' best prospect, as Lapierre is a borderline NHL player at this point already. Finally, moving on to the Atlantic Division, starting with the Boston Bruins, we have Fabian Lyselle. Boston has one of the worst prospect pools in the league. The only thing that separates them from Vegas in my eyes is they do have some decent depth options after Lyselle with guys like Jack Studnicka. That being said, Lyselle may be one of Boston's best draft picks in a long time. He really showed off what he can do in the WHL playoffs last season with 21 points in 12 games, a very encouraging sign for him. Next, with the Buffalo Sabres, I have Jack Quinn. Now, Buffalo has a number of guys that you could put here. Ultimately, it came down to Quinn, Power, and Peterka for me. But I think Quinn just gets the edge, even if I really like Peterka. All 3 of them could potentially be Calder candidates next season, so if you're into prospects and rookies, you might want to watch some Buffalo games next year. Next, with the Detroit Red Wings, I have Simone Edvinson. Edvinson was a classic Yzerman pick. Many questioned the pick at the time, but those who know better know to never question Stevie Y, says the guy that questioned the Casper pick. Edvinson has developed exceptionally well, so Detroit's 1-2 punch of offensive D-men in Seider and Edmondson look to be set for the next decade or so on defense. For the Florida Panthers, I have Grigory Denisenko. Denisenko is a fine prospect, but he probably shouldn't be your best one, especially on a team like the Panthers that hasn't had much success until very recently. He's probably a middle 6 guy at best, but given Florida's propensity for scoring goals, watch him score 30 goals next season or whenever he becomes a mainstay in their lineup. Next, for the Montreal Canadiens, I have Juraj Slafkovsky. This was one of the easiest picks. I still like Shane Wright more and think the Habs probably should have gone with him, but Slafkovsky is no slouch. Most teams would be more than happy to have a guy like Slafkovsky in their system. That being said, I'm not sure how ready he is for the NHL action. Even if he has the body for it, Montreal might be better off giving him a year to develop in the AHL. For the Ottawa Senators, I have Jake Sanderson. When the Sens drafted Sanderson 5th overall in 2020, many eyebrows were raised. Some criticized the move as a classic Sens pick, but it looks like this one might just work out. He really worked on developing his offensive game last season, and it showed on the score sheet. When he was drafted, the main concern was is he going to really bring that much offense to the NHL? And it looks like he just might be able to do that. For the Tampa Bay Lightning, I have Lucas Edmunds. Edmunds was taken as a double overager, 86th overall in the 2022 draft. I don't have particularly high expectations for him, but Tampa's prospect pool is pretty thin, and I do kind of like Edmunds. Finally, for the Toronto Maple Leafs, I have Nick Robertson. Wasn't that long ago when Nick was seen as the better of the two